Welcome, everybody. It's Sunday. You know what time it is. Community Works Institute Spotlight Series. Um, for those that don't know, communityworksinstitute.org is where you need to go to get your K through 16 students involved with. We do consulting stuff. We do DEI work. We do ethnography, storytelling, the whole works. We've got some institutes coming up. Check it out, communityworksinstitute.org. Joe Brooks does the Friday show. I do the Sunday show. And I'm Zach Ritter. I'm the Associate Dean of Students at Cal State Dominguez Hills here in LA, Carson, Southern California. And I also do diversity consulting work. And part of that journey brought me in touch with this gentleman here today, Jason Craig Harris. And he is I was reading your bio and was like just very impressed. I like the spiritual guide. That we got to get into that. We got to talk about that. But you're director of diversity and inclusion at Friends Seminary, and you're at is it the Perspective Institute as well?
Perception Institute.
Perception Institute. And our paths crossed because we were in a workshop together, and we just vibed. And so tell the people about what you do. You're a speaker, you're a writer, you're a consultant, you're many things. Tell us.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm grateful for you and for Joe Brooks at the Community Works Institute, and it's so good to be in dialogue with you, my dear brother. And you know, I like to introduce myself by my sense of vocation, and so I think of myself as a healer and as a bridge builder and as somewhat of a midwife. And so what I mean by that is that my responsibility is to join along individuals and institutions and organizations that are on their journey to becoming something else, to becoming something different. And that sense of vocation and call to be a healer and a bridge builder has led me to express that vocation in a variety of ways. And so some days it means that I'm a professional mediator helping people to sort through conflicts related to, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, or communication, or gaps in understanding. Sometimes it means that I'm a restorative justice practitioner, where I am laboring with various groups that find themselves having experienced harm and are trying to desperately heal from harm, rectify harm, repair the breaches. Sometimes it means that I'm a strategist, where I'm thinking about policy and practice and the ways in which our policies and practices at the institutional level you know, have a deferential impact most often on individuals who are already systemically marginalized. Sometimes it means that I'm a coach, a leadership coach, an executive coach, where I am sitting down with organizational leaders and helping them to think through their next steps. And you know, one of my greatest sort of manifestations of all in terms of vocation is that of an educator and teacher. And so it means that I am often working with K through 12 students and occasionally college students to think about you know, how to make sense of this complicated, interconnected world that is both beautiful and engaging and mysterious and enchanting, but also a world in which there are overlapping systems of violence that threaten to unmake the social fabric. So journeying alongside students and trying to make sense of that in age-appropriate ways, I consider that to be my highest call and a deep honor.
I mean, we just came off of a very difficult week, I think, for America. Like we as diversity educators, and even me just being first generation Jewish guy in this country, like, and I'm sure with your identities, we know that this has been going on for a long time. I don't think other people knew this is going on for a long time. And so I think it's good sometimes to have that mirror just right in front of your face because then you can see all the ugliness and see the parts that, woo, we need to do something different. I don't usually jump into current events like this with other folks, but I think you and I, we go there. So when you were watching these images, like what was going through your mind?
Mm. Reflecting on the insurrection at the Capitol, is a weighty endeavor. It brings up all kinds of emotions and reflections, and so I think, if I go back in time to Tuesday and Wednesday, a couple things come to mind for me. I think that I was thinking of this whole experience as a culmination of a system of toxic ideas that had been churned about over and over again by, the outgoing presidential administration and allies to that administration. But, as someone who believes in thinking historically and philosophically, I have to say those ideas, this toxic brew of hypermasculinity and white supremacism and unchecked capitalism and outright greed, ignorance, and hate. I would say that toxic cocktail, if you will, began centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're seeing now is really a recycling of those ideas, which are ultimately meant to justify the status quo. And what concerns me is that so many individuals who participated in this violent insurrection at the Capitol are folks who actually stand to benefit a lot, were they to actually ally with more progressive causes that include everyone.
Yeah.
They, I think, have been sold a false bill of goods that would suggest that their well-being is directly connected to my lack of well-being, in that, in order for them to survive, they actually must violently exclude me on every end and every side, and actually exclude you too, my dear Jewish brother.
Right.
So I think that for me, this is what happens when a country fails to collectively grapple with its racist and anti-Semitic history.
Yeah.
And because we have never collectively really addressed the problems of history, they continue to repeat themselves, and we continue to relive the nightmare, this dystopic reality that we're all thrusted in.
Right.
So, I think for me, I thought about it at that larger level. And I think, finally, I would just say that, I come from the spiritual place of compassion. It's not that I'm not full of anger and rage at the current state of events. I mean, as James Baldwin would say, how could I not be? To be Black in America is to be full of rage all the time. So it's not that, but what it is that I sense a deeper level of systemic and human brokenness at the heart of these excessive systems of violence. And so when I saw these mostly white folks, many of whom I suspect are at least okay with racism, even if they wouldn't omit it overtly.
Right.
And I saw these folks, I saw human beings who are complicit in systems of evil, but who have also been victimized by those systems, even if they would not consciously admit that truth.
Right. 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 So I read this article in the Atlantic by Adam Serwer, and he was saying these folks were not poor white people. They were lawyers, they were doctors, they were bankers, they were stay-at-home moms and dads. And he made the comparison, the KKK were not all poor white people. They were ministers, they were quote unquote respected people in the community. I think we have to get serious about this narrative, both learning Black and brown history in a more honest and open way and teaching everybody this history so we can actually progress as a country we need to do, some type of reparations because folks are hurting, both financially, but also from trauma from past, genocides in this country. And the irony is that there's a lot of white folks in that crowd that were, hey, this country is being taken away from me. We just had a black president. Now we have the first black and South Asian woman vice president. And the election was stolen from me. This is mine. This is my country. Donald Trump is my savior. He represents me because it's my collective white grievances. And just what you said, white lives in this country would be better if black and brown lives mattered more. And that's the thing we don't talk about, right? That's what we always talk about, the zero sum thing. And that's what you and I do in this work in diversity and inclusion. And hopefully justice is, there's the moral argument for DEI work, and good, that works for some folks. Not gonna work for everybody. There's a monetary argument. That works for more folks because we're in a very capitalist country. And it's even going back to this Eisenhower thing of all boats rise in a rising sea. And I don't understand. I do. Is the propaganda over a long period, not just the last 4 years, over a long period of time. You know this better than I, right? Like 1965, when we passed the Civil Rights Acts, the media started doing the propaganda that black and brown people are welfare queens, they're taking our money, they're taking blah, 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 blah. And it was only in the last like 5 years, Michelle Obama was like, yo, we built the White House. Like we built this. I mean, is all this a reaction to a black presidency?
That's a powerful question. And I think my answer's complicated. I think that we saw white, and I would say largely racist forces converge on the Capitol. And that convergence, I think there's something about it that seems to me to be false, right? Because, there's a lot of investment in systems of racism to present themselves as wholly coherent and as in solidarity with each other without any fractures within their coalition.
Mm.
And so I think that there's a way to look at folks who were, insurrectionists at the Capitol and to disaggregate them just a little bit more, right? So because there were poor white folks there, people who had no teeth,
right,
folks who are struggling, who were there, who've been sold this false bill of goods,
right,
and who really do believe like it's because of all the minorities that we don't have access to X, Y, and Z, why our livelihood has not been prioritized, why the factories are gone.
right.
That represents a segment of the population that were there at the Capitol. And those folks, I think, have some serious work to do to think a little bit more carefully about the smokescreen that's been up. Like, really, how much do you really benefit from white supremacist capitalism? I mean, is it really in your interest, or are you simply satisfied with what W.E.B. Du Bois or David Roediger might call the psychological wage of whiteness, where you are simply okay with the status quo because you think it somehow benefits you psychically to be connected to people like Donald Trump? I mean, that's in part why many people voted for him. They said, well, not only does he have my interest, but I actually view him as a externalized projection of who I want to be in the world. I want to be able to be so wealthy and so powerful and so unchecked that I can say and do whatever I want without consequences, right? So that's at least one group of people. And I would say that, yes, there were also, white professionals who were there, and for me, them being white, of course, is critical to the story. But what's more important to me is not the actual phenotypic whiteness of their skin. It is their ideological racism that drives them. So really, I want to refer to these folks as racists. I want to emphasize that piece because I think that's the critical piece. But these racists to use the term in the way that Ibram Kendi might,
Mm,
these racists, these segregationists who
mm,
care deeply about their power and the power of people who look like them, absolutely they imagine themselves to be the rightful owners and caretakers of this land. And they have a whole entire mythologizing project of retelling the history of this land to be a history of their triumph.
right.
And yes, they imagined the election of our first Black president, Barack Obama, to be a blow
Mm,
to their collective self-imagination.
mm,
And this is why the Southern Poverty Law Center chronicled a rise in hate groups
mm,
starting in 2008.
yeah.
Where I am in New York State, there are about 47 official hate groups,
Wow.
according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 25 of which have their headquarters in New York City, which is hailed to be one of the most diverse places in
Mm,
the world.
mm,
So what we are seeing is we are seeing a reactionary group of people who feel aggrieved, an aggrieved sense of entitlement that something has been stolen from them. But the irony of this, Zach, is that they don't realize, in my opinion, they don't realize that the thing that was stolen from them wasn't the country, but it was their humanity.
mm,
I mean, there's a real consequence to aligning yourself with abusive power.
mhm,
There's a real consequence to saying, I proudly stand up as a white nationalist. What part of yourself and your history and your connection to the various indigenous groups of people that we all come from, what part of that did you have to give up for this lie
right.
of being a part of this collectivity that is toxic? I've spent some time with some ex-white supremacists,
Mm,
people who have repented of the ideology of white supremacy and who have worked to become a new person, an anti-racist self. And they would say that they were attracted to white supremacism and to white nationalism and to neo-Nazism because they felt like those folks were creating a narrative, watch this, of belonging.
mhm,
That those folks were creating a narrative of belonging that included them and that accrued to them a certain sense of power and identity and purpose.
mhm,
If there was ever a reason for purpose-driven education today, that's the reason. That's
mhm,
why our schools have to do a powerful job of creating what I would think of as a compelling, intoxicating vision of belonging that is so thick in its allure that it has the capacity to counter the narrative of belonging that are being put out on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram through white supremacist groups.
mm,
I mean, white supremacist groups are recruiting on college campuses. And my friend,
mhm.
they're not looking for me. They're recruiting for our young white boys and girls and non-binary students.
Right.
So it's the job of educators, and I would say all folks of goodwill, to begin to think about how do we create a radically inclusive, democratic vision of belonging that is rooted and grounded in revolutionary love that
Mm,
brings everyone along. Now that's lofty. I mean,
mhm.
obviously there are so many small ways in which we need to instantiate that vision, but that's what we need, Zach.
So I want to get into your background and how you got interested in this stuff. But you just brought up something, so we'll touch on it real quick. Bell Hooks talks about this love ethic and this notion like we got to bring in all spheres when we go to the supermarket, when we, when we're hanging out with our loved ones, when we're hanging out with our non-loved ones, we need to bring this like compassion, honesty, trust, a love ethic into the world. Um, I don't know. It's a badly formed question, but like, how do we, God, how do we do that in this time, like right now? Because it seems so difficult to bring a love ethic into a world that is like whatever 4,000 people are dying a day, like people are traumatized, racial injustice, George Floyd. Like, I don't know. How do we bring a love ethic into this moment?
That's a beautiful question. And, I'm a great fan of Bell Hooks's work. And, I think that, the love ethic has to be manifested in a range of ways. So I think of it as something that first applies to me as a person, right? That there is a toxic brew of ideas that is at work in our wider culture. And so my job is to practice radical self-love
Mm,
so that I can create a shield around my sense of self over and against those anti-Black
mm,
ideas that exist in the world. So
mm,
that's number one. And that's the same, I would say that that's true as well for folks, who are not Black, who are perhaps people of color, and even folks who aren't people of color, who are white folks. There's work to be done in terms of self-love. If I refuse to allow my sense of self to be erected on top of the diminishment of other people, I'm doing the love ethic for me.
mm,
There's research that suggests that young white people who are in white affluent communities actually tend to be victimized by perfectionism, by the
mm.
myth of being perfect, which the historian in me wants to link that ideology of perfectionism to the ideology of white supremacism.
Yeah.
And so these young white people who are in these white affluent communities feel like they have to be perfect. And so they are, they're terrified, they're scared, they know they can't live up to the perfection. And what do? They go to all kinds of numbing agents. They go to drugs, they go to alcohol, and then you have all these young white folks who are in rehab of all kinds. So I would just want to note here that I want white people to practice self-love as well, not loving themselves because they are white,
Mm,
but loving themselves despite the fact that they are culturally white.
mm, mm,
And so it begins with, and then the same is true, for us as people of color, is to love ourselves over and against these ideas. But the second piece is to practice that love ethic in our interpersonal relationships everywhere.
mm,
And so, I believe, yes, there are moments in time when we have to separate ourselves from people who are in this moment toxic and who do not want to engage in this work of belonging and love. I believe that we can affirm their humanity and set them to the side so that we can get to work with people who will listen to us. We often focus on, the KKK member, like,
mm,
oh my goodness, I don't know how to practice love with that person over there. And my point is, I'm not asking you to, but I am asking you to practice love with the KKK adjacent person. Could we not practice love with folks who are a little bit more open-minded, but who may not be fully on board? Can we practice love with those folks rather than just lumping them all together? And so that love ethic in interpersonal spaces means that I am committed to your dignity, and I'm committed to doing whatever I can to protect your dignity and doing whatever I can to make sure that I don't diminish your dignity, regardless of who you are as a person. And then finally, the next step, and that's just quickly, that means that it manifests in how I communicate with you, how I talk with you, how I listen to your story, how I make room for your perspective, the differences that exist between us. It means that I'm always seeking your highest good. And I always hold out the possibility that you could be more than what I see in this moment.
mm,
As Brian Stevenson would say, that each of us is actually more than what we've done on our worst day. That's the love ethic, right?
mm,
I'm not going to reduce any human to this one moment, not reducing you, right? Because once I reduce you, I'm complicit in systems of dehumanization. So I'm not going to do that. The next level is institutionalizing the love ethic in our policies and practices, in our schools, in our organizations, certainly in public policy, in our laws, and so on. And what that means is that I want to make sure that I don't have any sort of practice or policy that even unintentionally reinforces a sense of unfair social hierarchies.
mm,
You
mm.
know, I don't want to have that practice. So for example, let's just be really transparent and granular. Let's think for a moment about schools and what times
Yeah.
some schools, for example, might host their parent meetings.
Mm,
Let's say that a school decides that, we're going to host all of our parent meetings at 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning. And let's say we are in pre or post pandemic times. Who are the people who are most likely able to make those meetings?
mm,
In many schools, that means often individuals who are wealthy enough,
mhm,
who don't have to work outside of their home and who are able perhaps to even take off time, and who are able to come to these sort of meetings. And so what you notice is that creates an inequity in the school community, because there are plenty of parents and caregivers who care deeply about their children, but who can't actually make a morning meeting. So a school that is interested in thinking critically about the love ethic and how to institutionalize it and how to institutionalize compassion and policy would say, we actually need to adjust these meetings. Maybe we can do some meetings in the morning. Maybe we do some in the evening. Maybe we alternate so that we are constantly bringing in a different demographic of parents so that we're getting a more diverse range of feedback. Right? That's a concrete practice. What does it mean, for example, to constantly have students who are traveling 2 hours to get to your school marked late, and then to award them a detention as a result of that? How is that fostering inequality? You
Right.
have students who live around the corner from the school who get there with no problem, but if you are relying on public transportation and you live 2 hours away,
Right.
that policy of an inflexible late time, sort of consequence is the opposite of what it means to institutionalize the love ethic.
Right. 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 And this is what Power of Purpose, the Purpose of Power, Alicia Garza says in her new book, is that white folks are often taught that racism is a mean person saying a mean word. She says, no, racism is rigged rules, a rigged system for a certain group of people. And so what you're saying is there is institutional sexism, classism, racism within not only our schools, our courtrooms, our prison system, our banking system, federal loans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that is benefiting certain dominant groups in our society, aka men, aka white folks, aka able-bodied folks, heterosexual folks, you name it. And what I think we are doing in our work is trying to change some of these rules to make it more equitable for everybody. And at the end of the day, if that Trump person who's storming the Capitol says, well, what's in it for me? Yeah, you might get some health care. You might get some more affordable college for your kids. And, you might get better infrastructure and transportation in your city. So there is something in this for everybody. It's not just like, I have a big heart and I want Black and brown folks to be finally, free and liberated in this country. It's actually freeing white people from their own constructs of whiteness, right?
No, I just want to pause here to say that is exactly what we're talking about. And we are also thinking about, the ways in which toxic ideas have an impact on our physiology. We can't imbibe hatred, which is merely a justification to keep greedy power structures in place, to be clear. So it's that greed comes first and hatred comes second, right? Hate is the product of the greed. Hate is the product of these systems of abusive power that benefit the few over and against the life chances of the many. So you can't imbibe those toxic ideas without them creating consequences. Imagine that you are leading a life where you are afraid of every brown person that you see, and you happen to live in a place like New York City. You are going to encounter some real challenges, my friend, right? Imagine that as a result of all of that fear, your amygdala constantly lighting up, your body over time is actually becoming weaker. I mean, there's recent research that suggests that individuals who espouse racist beliefs actually tend to have weaker hearts and are more inclined to have cardiovascular trouble.
Wow.
So the idea that you can traffic in toxic ideas and that you can participate wholly in these systems of injustice without there being consequences for you is a problem. I mean, I have to say this other thing, research in the field of neuroscience and social psychology suggests that there are some white folks in the world who, because of their intensely homogenous surroundings and their lack of a real rigorous practice of empathy, cannot detect pain in Black bodies.
Oh, God.
Right. So that, for example, there was a study that was done that where this group of white folks were brought into a room to observe another white person receiving an inoculation. And the researchers had put all these brain scans tools on these white participants. And, when these white folks were looking at another white person receiving a vaccination, The white folks who were the observers, their brains lit up, right? On these brain scans just lit up, and it was clear that they were identifying with the person who was receiving the inoculation, that they too were in some ways living through that moment with them through their mirror neurons, for example. Okay. But when these white folks had to observe a Black person receiving an inoculation, the brain scans showed nothing. There was minimal activity in the fear center of the brain. And so they were actually habituated into a lack of empathy for Black people. And so, in other words, that those white folks, their ability to have empathy, which by the way is a skill for living in this 21st century globally interconnected world, their ability to have empathy was significantly diminished, which by the way, Forbes would argue that many Fortune 500 companies really are looking for employees who have deep social and emotional intelligence. If you can't identify with people of color in pain, then how can you work at a company that's doing all this work around the world with these different cultures and different racial groups? It's really hard. So my point is, white folks themselves have to be invested in this work because it benefits them. They become much more attuned to their own humanity, much more emotionally intelligent, which as we know from the Yale study, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, means that the EQ is far more correlated to professional success than IQ.
Wow.
And if the world was going to be only, a desert of whiteness, if that was going to be the future of the United States, then maybe white folks could just go off into their own colony and lead their life and do their things. But guess what? According to the Pew Forum, according to recent research, that is not the demographic trajectory of the United States, my dear brother.
Right. And we have that experiment in Europe for like 2,000 years. And let me tell you, it's not a peaceful history when white folks just live amongst white folks. My people could, and Romani folks could let you know that it didn't turn out so well, right? But that's the interesting thing that we don't have time to get into, but like the French were killing the Germans and the Germans were killing the Italians, and we find new ways to hate on each other. And I think I would like, and it's already starting to happen, but the next iteration of justice work to combine race, class, and gender, right? And the intersectionality of all these things. And I think the progressive movement is starting to talk about, well, how do we change capitalism, right? Because capitalism in itself is killing, it's going to kill everybody if we keep going at the rate we're going. And I think a lot of the whatever banners and flags at the Capitol riots, stop communism, stop socialism, stop all this stuff, the Democrats are the devil. And I think we need to start talking about healthy alternatives to the path that we're going down. And I'm not saying Stalinist and Maoist totalitarian, killing of a lot of people is definitely not the way to go. But we need to start thinking again so that white, Black, brown, Asian, everybody's lives can be prolonged, because at the rate we're going, we're jumping off the edge of a cliff here. But I want to know, and the listeners want to know about you. Like, who are you? Like, how did you get into this stuff? Tell us about your K through 16 experience. Were there like moments of aha, or like, I need to get into this work, I have something to say?
Thanks for that question. I think that I've always felt this call to the seeking of information and knowledge. There was something in me, and maybe it came from my working class, low income, brilliant, beautiful, creative Black mother, immigrant from Jamaica, who said, even though I didn't finish high school, I want you and your brother to finish, and I want you to go all the way. Maybe it was she who implanted in me this deep commitment to spending time with young people and investing in the next generation. My mom, very early on in my life, opened a daycare. And so, I must have been 3-4 years old as she started to caretake for children. And then she would employ me to be their teacher. and to read, do some read alouds and projects and tutoring with these young people. And so, I grew up sort of helping to raise other people's children.
Mm.
And my mom's commitment was we love every single child. So we actually at different times had a multiracial daycare owned by a Black woman who spent time pouring love into these children. And, I would say that my justice commitments were stirred by my mom as well. I remember situations where my mom, had these wonderful clients who would come to her to watch their children, and those clients would experience incredible pain,
Mm.
and life would just happen to them in such brutal ways. And my mom would have to take clothes off of her back, or she'd have to cook an extra meal and send home with families, days when she watched and caretake for children and didn't get paid for it. Or I remember one time she had a client Black mother of 2 or 3 girls, who the father of the girls was apparently a violent man and had threatened to kill the mother and the kids. And so my mom came to me and said, I must have been 10 or 11. She said, Jason, I know we only have a 2-bedroom home, but it's more than what they have. Can we hide them out here in our apartment
Mm.
for a couple of weeks until they get back on their feet? And so my mom hid this woman and her children in our apartment. And then when the father came by, my mom opened the door and said, yeah, no, I have no idea where they are. I haven't seen them, haven't heard from them. Meanwhile, they were hiding out in a back room in our apartment.
Wow.
So my mom put her life on the line and took great risks to protect, this family. So, my mom stirred in me a deep commitment to justice and to service and to compassion. And so it shaped the rest of my life. So when I got to college, I immediately got involved with justice work and started learning about the intersections of race and gender, religion, and power. And I grew up as a boyhood, a child preacher in the evangelical and Pentecostal Black tradition. And so I was really interested in religious studies and learning about the complicity of religion in systems of injustice, but also of the incredible resources religions, plural, have offered social justice movements and struggles, the struggle for freedom and dignity. And so I got to college and I had a great reckoning of trying to understand, what does it mean to have some sense of spirituality and the notion that all that I see is not all that there is?
Mm.
How do I maintain that reality even while I, am a deep intellectual who deals in ideas and materialism and who cares about, the impact of violence on people's bodies and life chances? So I had a crisis of faith in some respects because in all of my study, I realized just how much religion had been complicit in systems of evil. But I also realized that I needed to ground my hope for earthly transformation in something that was transcendent. And so I turned to the social gospels and to liberation theology, and then, stretched beyond to more interfaith work and studied various streams of Judaism and Islam and Buddhism as a way to try to understand what mystics were saying about reality and about how to confront evil and suffering without becoming evil, without imposing more suffering. That quest led me to think, I actually want to become a college professor. And that's what I thought I was going to do. I was going to do a minister/college professor combo. And so I started lecturing at some different colleges, went to graduate school to study religion, ethics, and cultural studies. And I was really enjoying it, and I was like, I'm gonna get this doctorate, and I'm gonna do this college thing, and it's gonna be awesome. I'm gonna be sort of like Zach in some ways. And then I started. I ended up helping to co-found a think tank, a global studies think tank that focused on post-colonial theory and faith communities and justice work. And so we did all kinds of really cool projects, and it was so much fun. But it gave me this desire to sort of, be in the room where it happens, if you will. So I said, let me try a little bit of teaching, at the secondary level. Let's do a little bit of high school stuff. And I started slowly dipping my toes and everything. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with focusing on teaching as opposed to focusing on researching. And for me, it became, like the primary thing for me is the teaching. I'm going to always be a researcher because I'm always going to be reading and consuming ideas and producing ideas. But the thing that I want to be at the forefront is the mentoring and the supporting and the coaching work that happens with students. So, long story short, that work led me to, becoming director of diversity and inclusion, and therefore interfacing with every sort of division of students, elementary school students, middle school students, high school students, and spending so much time with young people, helping them to make sense of the world and to develop a sense of purpose and agency in this world. And so, that work connects me deeply to the classroom, and to being in the space where we're trying to really work it out, try to practice democracy in that particular microcosmic space. But also it dovetails with, my being a minister and a spiritual guide, and also my having a consulting practice where, I am trying to help a range of people to better understand and make sense of the world and to make sense of their particular calling and vocation in that context. All of us can do something for justice. We can't do everything, but we can do something. And part of my life's goal is to help as many people of all ages do that work. The final thing I'll just say is that being a teacher at heart has shaped how I approach all the other dimensions of my work. I am interested in the work, the iterative work of trying and failing and then revising and trying again. I'm interested in the work of let's sit down and scaffold this learning so we can make sure that you understand these concepts and these ideas and how they apply to you. For me, it's no longer just about being the sage on the stage, but it's about being the guide on the side, really working in the trenches with people to help them better understand these truths, because I ultimately believe that education is the practice of freedom.
Right. I like that. I like that. Yeah, the practice of freedom.
We had to throw in a little more bell hooks and
Yeah,
polyphony a little bit just to round it out, my dear brother.
I love it. I love it. What? So let's get into some of the work that you do now, because that was powerful. A lot of the work we do is individual change, and I like what you say about democracy in the classroom, and also systemic change. For K through 16 educators who are listening to this session, they're like, I trying to figure out what I can do on an individual level and what I can do on a systemic level. Give the people like what's something they could do on an individual, and what's a systemic change they could do.
That's fantastic. Being able to serve as an educator, a teacher in a classroom is an amazing honor. These young people look at us as though we have the keys to the universe and as though we know and we can unlock the mysteries of the multiverse. And so, I think that there's a real opportunity in the classroom to create lessons and curriculum that prepare our young people for the world that is, so they can bring about a world that ought to be. So when I'm in the classroom teaching and I'm creating lessons that help young people to think about global challenges and global problems and their place in it. And that is where creative, impactful work can happen. So an example is that, I want to make sure that my young people understand the Holocaust. For example, I'm co-teaching an 8th grade ethics and social justice class right now. And so, my job is to do research so that I better understand all the different components of what went into making the Holocaust a reality, and for some people, a justifiable reality, and having to take something so complex like genocide and try to help my 8th grade students understand how these toxic ideas come together with abuse of power to make that happen is a tremendous undertaking. And so in the classroom, what I do is I make room for students to process these kinds of horrific events in a personal way, where they can talk about the impact of reading, this challenging material about this horrible happening, right?
mm,
Making room for them to think a little bit about, okay, so now that I've read about the Holocaust, what parallels can I draw to contemporary times?
uh,
Do we see any parallels of propaganda and scapegoating that laid the foundation for the Holocaust? Do we see that today? And can we talk about current events in that context? And then we go a level deeper and we think about, wait a minute, let's talk about our own stories, our own histories, our family stories. Do we have stories in our own families where a particular social identity group was uplifted and protected, while another social identity group that we're connected to was downtrodden and dismissed and marginalized? For me, the idea is making sure that our young people can talk about themselves
mm,
with accuracy and with a real sense of their own value, apart from any notion of superiority or inferiority,
mm,
right? That's the identity domain
mm,
of what I might call an anti-bias curriculum.
mm,
The next level is diversity, which is about, how do I create lessons in my classroom where young people are getting exposed to people who are different from them and are developing accurate language for describing those differences? What films am I showing, for example? What books are on display in my classroom space? Are the books that are on display in my classroom space both reflective of the students who are there, but also reflective of the students who are not there?
mm,
Right? How am I equipping our young people with language for understanding the diversity of the world, right?
mm,
The next dimension is justice. Am I helping my young people through my lessons to better understand the systems of unfairness that
mm,
are at work in our world?
mm,
Am I giving them age appropriate language for being able to talk about the civil rights movement, to talk about the women's liberation movement, the LGBTQ history movement? Is that a part of the conversation that I'm having with students in the classroom, even in math and in science? Am I doing mathematical problems that include, issues from real life? Can we talk about, for example, the number of young people who have access to quality education around the world and the number of young people who don't,
mm,
right? Can I not program those statistics in my math problems so that my students are learning how to do statistics and how to do math, but also learning about global challenges? What
mm,
am I teaching in science? What am I teaching in chemistry? Can I talk about the chemistry of water pollution and
mm,
what happened in Flint, Michigan, for example, right? So it's not just in the humanities, it's also in every domain we can bring this awareness. So we're talking about identity, diversity, justice, and we're also talking about action.
mm,
Am I equipping young people to take action wherever they see unfairness, from teaching them how to interrupt and to address microaggressions at the interpersonal level, for example, right? How to call people in, how to use particular sentence stems to start difficult and challenging conversations, right?
mm,
Those are strategies of social emotional learning and how
mm,
to navigate conflict and relationships that we can teach our young people. But also, am I teaching them to look at, I don't know, the policies of the school? Are there some practices and policies in our school that are inequitable that the young people in our class could take action on? For example, we had eighth graders at our school say, listen, our dress code is sexist.
mm,
It's gendered in a way that's not helpful. So we convened a democratic process, bringing in focus groups of eighth grade students to work together to rewrite the middle school dress code,
mm,
actually looking at equity within the school context. And the next step is thinking about action outside the domains of the school. So at my school, we have worked really hard to equip students with the tools they need so that they can interface with lawmakers from the city level to the state level and even the federal level. We have students who every year participate in a lobbying training, for
mm,
example, and then they interface with lawmakers. We've bused students all the way up to Albany, New York, so that they could make their case to state level lawmakers as to why rules and regulations that furnish mass incarceration needed to be changed, why solitary confinement was inhumane,
mm,
right? And so giving students opportunities where they can use their voices. Some of our students are going to be great at using their voices to be public speakers and lobbyists. Some of them, their gift is in writing, and so they should be engaging in letter writing campaign. We just did a letter writing campaign for our 7th grade as a participation in Amnesty International's Right for Rights campaign. We do it every year to help students understand how the written word, the pen, can help them to practice their rights to educate and to advocate on behalf of others. We have some students whose their gift is art. So how are we using their talents, for example, to raise awareness around different challenges in the school community or beyond it? We had students who participated in an artistic campaign in collaboration with the New York City Commission on Human Rights, using their artwork to spread awareness around critical issues, right? So my point is that we want to engage in purpose-driven education, which means helping our young people connect what they're learning in the classroom to real life issues, and then ensuring that they have a sense of how their own talents and skills can be used to actually address real issues. Right? We're not just learning for learning's sake. We are learning because we believe that learning is transformative, and the information that we learn and the tools that we cultivate can help us to remake the world. So I believe that educators and teachers and school-based professionals can do that kind of work with young people, not shying away from controversial issues, because, by the way, the students are already talking about it. The question is how we can come alongside them to make space to have those conversations. The first thing a teacher could do starting tomorrow is walk into your classroom and say to students, I just want to make space for whatever you're feeling right now. Why don't we pause for a moment and sit down? And I'm going to ask each of you to offer one word that represents how you're feeling. And then to offer just a few sentences of why you think you feel that way. We're going to do a little journaling so that those of us who are more introverted and passive, perhaps, and need a little bit more time for processing, can spend some time thinking about it. And then in about a minute or two, we're going to share out in a sequential circle fashion. Each student has an opportunity to share a little bit about what they're feeling. And then the next question could be, a lot's happening in our country right now. What are you hearing? What are you hearing? And let's talk that through. Let's make space in the classroom for what's happening now. And if students raise questions, we can say, you know what? That's a brilliant question. I don't know the answer to it. So why don't we do a little research project for a day or two to answer some of those questions? That's how we do organic, inquiry-driven education, where the students are centered in the educational process, and we are pulling out of them the resources that are already there. That's something that teachers can do immediately starting tomorrow.
If you had a group of, and I love it, I was writing notes in my little thing here as you were speaking. If you had a group of adults that are either running the school or whatever, what kind of activity would you do with adults to try to get them to wrap their heads around this justice work as well?
So there's 1,000, of these sort of activities, right? But I think for me, everything comes back to storytelling. Everything comes back to the power of stories to unlock our imagination and to help us to notice things we wouldn't notice otherwise. And so one thing that I would be inclined to do is to get that group of leaders and educators to sit in a circle, to remove all tables, anything that would separate us from each other or obstruct our vision of each other. We would remove it out the way, and then we would create a focal point in the center of that circle that includes the core values of the group. And we'd ask each person to contribute some symbolic object to that centerpiece. And then we would actually move into what we call a peacemaking circle in the indigenous tradition, which is a tradition in which individuals are able to contribute ideas and thoughts and experiences in a conversation through a particular dialogue format that requires a passing of a talking piece around the circle, so that when you have the talking piece, you can speak. When you don't have it, your job is to listen. There's no cross talking or interrupting. The circle keeper, who would be me in that moment, is not a neutral facilitator removed and staged in some kind of setting of objectivity, but the circle keeper is a participant in that circle, which is a sacred space. It's actually a kind of sacred geometry, if you will. And we would be in that circle, and my job as circle keeper would be to pose a prompt and to respond, and then to allow everyone around that circle to have an opportunity to speak to that question. The key about circles is that you have to speak from your heart. You have to speak from the place of story. And so I could ask a question like, could you tell a story about a time when you could have acted on your core values, but you didn't? Each person would have to respond to that prompt. What could change for those folks if they heard other leaders telling stories about failure rather than stories about success? What kind of humility would that open up for learning, for adult learning, right? Tell a story about a time when you felt like you didn't fit in, either because you were hyper visible or because you were invisible. What kind of empathy and compassion could happen in that space if every person had an opportunity to respond to that question? Tell a story about one of your names, your first name, middle name, last name, nickname. Tell a story about what that name means to you, how you got it, and what's your relationship to it. You know, these are the kinds of values-based questions that we can ask in the context of a circle that can get people to go deeper into their own story, to become more connected to their bodies, and also to practice a tool that we desperately need, which is empathic listening. When you're sitting in a circle, and let's say there are 18 participants in that circle, you are 1/18th of that circle. You are speaking 1/18th of the time. As my very good friend Elizabeth Clements or Kay Pranis would say, you're speaking 1/18th of the time, which means that 17/18ths of the time you are listening. That practice of habituating yourself into a posture of perspective taking and listening and building empathy and building stamina to sit in a circle where some tensions might come up, some conflicts might come up, building the capacity for direct communication. Those are the tools that our educators and senior leaders need. Right? There are many senior leaders that are conflict averse, that want to avoid all of the sticky stuff. Well, you need to sit in a circle that can build your stamina for the sticky stuff. Right? So the idea here is that activity, I think, would be a transformative experience, because one of the tools that every leader, every educator needs is the capacity to listen well. How many systems of injustice happen and are perpetuated because there is no listening? It's not that people aren't speaking, they're just not being heard. So I would offer that as a gift to senior leaders and educators. And in fact, I spent a lot of time sitting in circle with various groups of people, from third graders, for example, to middle schoolers, to high schoolers, to groups of teachers, to senior leaders, to various kinds of chief executives of various nonprofits and corporations. And I've never seen a practice that has so reshaped how people think about themselves and how people relate. Like circle. Because now, even in my relating at the everyday interactive level, I think and relate in circle. I show up and I say, how can I listen? How can I attend to the voices that are not being heard in this space? How can I make room for feelings and emotions, and for complexity and for tension? How can I approach this conflict with compassion, but also with being straightforward and direct? How can I approach this conversation with an eye toward how we might heal and move forward together? All of that consciousness for me has really emerged because of the practice of circle.
Wow. I feel my own tension kind of lessening here as I'm listening to you, and I want to be in your classroom for real. I think a lot of people need to be in your classroom for real. We have to wrap it up here, but you are you are teaching about the world that is, so that you can teach your students the world that ought to be. You said that, and I love that.
I have to say that I wish I created that myself, but it's a direct quotation from the mission statement of my school, which is informed by Quaker practices, that we study the world that is so that we can bring about a world that ought to be, so that knowledge is connected to values.
Mm, I love that. I love that. We are transitioning into a new presidency. We are transitioning into a new era in a lot of ways. We are hoping for the world that ought to be. What is one thing that you are very much looking forward to that's going to be growing either in America, a different country, or the world? Something you are looking forward to in these next months to come of 2021.
That's a beautiful, beautiful question. The one thing that comes up for me in this moment is I am looking forward to a new story, new stories. I'm looking forward to seeing a more accountable administration, a more accountable media. I'm looking forward to seeing folks who are interested in using the power of language and the transformative potential of words to weave together stories that are hopeful, that are optimistic, and that bring us to accountability. In my mind, language is a powerful resource that can either be used as a tool for healing or a tool for division and hate. Words and language remind me of the surgeon's knife. That blade could be used to cut me in a way that ultimately heals me, or it can be used in a way that cuts me and ends my life. And so what I want words that cut, but words that cut to heal, not cut to kill. And so I think that we are on the precipice of seeing some very compelling stories that will be woven together by policymakers and educators and students and creatives, artists, stories woven for such a time as this. Those stories will enlarge our imagination. And with an enlargement of the imagination comes the transformation of the world.
Enlargement of the imagination comes with the transformation of the world. I love that. I love that. You're right. You're right. From your lips to the God's ears. Let's do it. Let's do it. And I always wonder why we still anthropomorphize God to be a man. I feel like we need to change that.
That's also a question of the impoverishment of our imagination.
Yeah, like she, they. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things to say. Anyway, we got to talk about spirituality another time.
We do.
You are a beautiful person. You are a beautiful soul, and you're not only beautiful because you're taking beauty into action, and you are changing students' lives. You are changing administrators' lives, and you are creating a microcosm of change that almost like a what's that thing in the sky, the Eagle Nebula, that it looks real funky, and it's making a lot of stars, and then it shoots these kind of new star life forms into the atmosphere. And I feel like at your school, the Friends School Seminary, you're shooting people out into the world that are gonna create their own change. They're going to be change agents in the world and producing more change. And that's the ripple effect that we do as educators, because you never know. We start planting seeds, and then those seeds plant other seeds, and blah, 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 and before you know it, we have a whole forest and a different narrative, right? Yeah. So amen to you, Ashe. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. CWI, Community Works Institute. Joe Brooks is the director of CWI. I'm a friend of CWI, and they we have dope conversations like this. Go on the website, communityworksinstitute.org. There's a winter workshop that is coming up, an institute that is coming up, and we do K through 16 educational moments like this. So check it out. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Jason, for being here. Really appreciate you. And we gotta work together on some other stuff, because this vibe was too good.
Yes, brother. I appreciate you so much, and I appreciate you and Joe and all the work that you're doing. So grateful.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, everybody who tuned in, listening out there. Peace and love. And in 2021, take some of the goodness, love ethic that we were talking about, put it up in here, put it right here, and put it on other folks that need it as well. And let's all learn, heal, and grow together, because that's what we need. Thank you, everybody.